Pleasure to be here remotely. I had my own exodus this week. Our apartment was damaged from a missile, and we had to live with my parents-in-law for a while, but everything is okay now. Let's go to the Exodus. Okay, the Exodus is a story. Bill Propp, my teacher at UC San Diego, once said in his commentary on the book of Exodus that it is the most important story in the Hebrew Bible. As a story, the investigation must begin from the text itself. Let's be clear, without the text, there would be no Exodus to explore through archaeology or the geosciences. So understanding the text is not just important, it's essential. But how do we understand a biblical text? This is where things get tricky, especially with the rise of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches in biblical scholarship, particularly in relation to archaeology. There is, of course, a lot to gain from such interdisciplinary approaches, as is demonstrated by this conference and the previous one, but there is also a great risk. The synthesis of insights from different fields of knowledge, each with its own methodological challenges and constantly widening knowledge base, is a fertile ground not only for honest mistakes, those can be corrected by collaborative efforts, but also for manipulations and distortions, often done to promote one's research or other agendas. Let me give you an example. Here is a verse from Genesis 36 that might be relevant to Edom of the Exodus. And these are the kings that reigned in the land of Edom before there reigned any king over the children of Israel. ואלה המלכים אשר מלכו בארץ אדום לפני מלוך מלך לבני ישראל. I quoted it in my paper in Vetus Testamentum on the architectural bias in biblical archaeology to show that our current archaeological understanding of early Edom as a nomadic kingdom provides an excellent background for a possible understanding of this verse and the ones that follow. We will get to the nomadic issue shortly, but first let's look at how the blurred interface between archaeology and biblical scholarship can be misused. In a critique of my paper, Israel Finkelstein wrote, "Yet, this is a priestly list, and if historical, depicts realities not later than the late 6th or 5th centuries BCE. According to Knauf, the background should be sought in local strongmen in the south after the Babylonian conquest of Edom." In addition to Axel Knauf, a renowned biblical scholar who did write extensively about Edom, Finkelstein refers to two other biblical scholars to support his claim for the late dating of this verse, André Lemaire and Dustin Nash. Well, I thought, with evidence from biblical criticism, it would be hard to argue. Maybe the philologist André Lemaire pointed to a late Aramaic vocabulary. Maybe Nash pointed to a Hebrew style typical of a later period. Or maybe Knauf analyzed a grammatical development unique to the Persian era. So I checked the sources. In the conclusion to his article, partially quoted by Finkelstein, Knauf explicitly says, the Edomite king list derives most probably from the end of the 6th or the beginning of the 5th century BCE. This is to be concluded from the history of settlement in southern Jordan. No grammar, no style, but archaeology. The archaeological evidence, or lack thereof, is the reason for the late dating of these verses. What about Nash? Maybe advances in biblical scholarship between 1985 and 2018 allowed him to produce textual evidence in support of a late date. Nash concludes, the present study suggests that the chapter, Genesis 36, reached its unique shape as the result of a specifically Judahite discursive project New interpretations of archaeological evidence from southern Jordan and the Negev reveal this context. Again, no linguistic hypothesis, no literary arguments, just archaeology. The archaeological evidence is the main, if not the sole reason for the late dating of the text. En Lemaire, l'interprétation de cette liste dans le cadre de la géographie et de l'histoire d'Edom reste obscure et problématique. À la lumière de notre rappel de la confusion textuelle classique Edom-Aram et de la naissance probable de la royauté édomite vers 846 à 841, on se demandera tout naturellement si cette liste originale. Also here, it is archaeology and the archaeologists who have concluded that Edom was established only late in the Iron Age that provide the main reason for the late dating of the text, or for its reference to Aram instead of Edom in this case. Finkelstein might have been better off sticking with the identification of the verse as priestly, as indeed many biblical scholars today do date it to the post-exilic period based on, at least in part, on textual arguments. But it is important to note that even the late dating of P is far from being certain. As Dick Friedman said in his talk yesterday, research is not based on democracy, and having a majority of scholars supporting a later date doesn't make it necessarily true. But is it really a priestly source? Well, I'm not a biblical scholar. I've studied the basics. I was fortunate to attend David Noel Friedman's final seminars on the Hebrew Bible here at UCSD during my PhD. I just missed Dick Friedman's classes. He had left San Diego the same year I arrived. Still, when it comes to textual issues, I rely on colleagues who are biblical scholars. Now, if we look at Dick Friedman's book, The Bible with Sources Revealed, we see that starting from verse 31, the verse about the kings who ruled in the land of Edom before any king ruled over the children of Israel, the text is marked in green. In Friedman's system, that means it's a J source, not P. So the only potentially valid to indirect argument for a late priestly dating of the passage is also gone. To sum up, we have just seen a textbook example of a circular reasoning. We have new 11th century BC archaeological evidence from the region of Edom. However, it cannot be related to the description of Edom in Genesis 36. Why? Because the chapter was written in the Persian period, a conclusion that in itself is primarily based on archaeology and the historical interpretation of archaeological evidence by the archaeologists from the previous century. This is quite remarkable. Let's now turn to the core argument of this paper, how archaeology is used to construct historical narratives, and what that means for understanding Edom and Moab, the kingdoms the Israelites are said to have encountered during the Exodus. Let's begin with Edom. Knauf, Nash, and Lemaire dismiss the historicity of the relevant biblical texts, largely based on one archaeological observation, the absence of permanent settlements in Edom before the late 8th century BCE. This conclusion is paired with a deeply ingrained assumption that only sedentary populations can develop historically meaningful societies, let alone kingdoms. This assumption is so fundamental, it often goes unspoken, but it has long shaped the interpretations of both archaeologists and biblical scholars. When 19th century German academics read about the kings of Edom who reigned before any king reigned over the children of Israel, they envisioned walled capitals, stone palaces, border forts, and other hallmarks of statehood. The text itself didn't require this imagery. It was supplied by modern expectation. And even today, many scholars continue to project these assumptions onto the ancient world, without questioning whether the biblical terms reflect their own categories or those of the people who wrote them. But what if we have been wrong all along? Take a look at the archaeological map of Edom and southern Moab. How many sites do we have from the late Bronze Age, a 400-year period during which we have textual attestations of the Shasu nomads of the region? Only one, just one, the Timna Valley. Does that mean the area was mostly empty? The answer is clear when we consider Timna. The archaeological remains there are copper mines and related industrial sites, and one shrine directly related to copper production. Clearly, it was the unique nature of their activity that made them archaeologically visible. Conclusion: except for extremely unique cases, archaeology cannot and will probably never be able to reveal the story of people who dwelled in tent. This should be emphasized. Even if some remains of encampments were to be detected by careful surveying, and even if these remains were somehow properly dated, understanding the social organization of the society behind them through archaeology is impossible. Zach Dunsant, the chair of this session, presented yesterday advancements in microarchaeology that potentially provide further insights into the subsistence practices of nomads. But this is far from being a solution for understanding whether they were part of the tribes of Genghis Khan or a marginal Bedouin tribe on the fringe of the Ottoman Empire. We have to be honest. And without dismissing the contribution of archaeologists of nomads, and yes, there are such, we have to admit that the bulk of potential evidence is forever lost, and that the potential evidence itself, even when found, allows for only an extremely limited understanding, basically for reaffirming the presence of nomads and sometimes reconstructing subsistence practices. Finkelstein said it before, and I quote, "We have to be aware of the limitations of our discipline, archaeology. Rosen can save himself time and frustration. More exhaustive fieldwork will not solve the problem of the invisible nomads. The comfortable library will." Right? Quite harsh. But will the library really solve the problem of understanding the invisible nomads? Because archaeology cannot solve it, naturally the basic solution came from Bedouin ethnography. But it became what I call the tyranny of Bedouin ethnography. The Bedouins became the image of the biblical nomad. In biblical archaeology and scholarship alike, consciously or unconsciously, it is so entrenched in scholarship that scholars often replace the word nomads with Bedouins in talks and publications. In this conference alone, I've already heard a few instances of the term Shasu Bedouins. Neil said it yesterday. Manfred Bitak said it today. There seems to be no escape. At the end of the Bronze Age, the Egyptian Empire collapsed. In 1140 BCE, the Egyptians left Timna, leaving the region and its rich copper resources to the local inhabitants, the nomadic tribes of Edom. Luckily for us archaeologists, they continue to engage in copper production, intensifying and expanding operations to the mines of Wadi Feinan. Thus, just by chance, we have got an extraordinary case of rich archaeology for a biblical nomadic society. And what we have seen is amazing. The nomads of the south were part of a complex society, far more so than what could have been deduced from Bedouin models. The industry itself, which until the work of Tom Levy in Wadi Feinan was thought to represent the organizational capabilities of empires alone, testifies to a well-organized society, thousands of mine shafts, some over 70 meters deep, and tens of thousands of broken furnaces and slag deposits. In both Timna and Feinan, tell a magnificent story of people working together in copper production and trade during the 11th to the 9th centuries BCE. If that's not enough, recent excavations in Timna revealed exquisite foods such as Mediterranean fish and fruits, luxury garments, and other evidence of long-distance trade. I should emphasize, these were nomads. We do not excavate their dwelling places. We, for the most part, don't know where their tents were located. We excavate mines and industrial camps, to which these nomads returned repeatedly, year after year, leaving materials for us to find. A few years ago, Dr. Naama Sukenik analyzed the color of 3 wolf textile fragments and confirmed that they were dyed from Timna here. They were dyed with biblical argaman, meaning the royal purple, the most expensive dye in ancient times. One fragment, even more remarkably, was dyed using 2 seasonal species in what Pliny the Elder called the double dyeing technique, reserved only for the finest garments used by kings. Interestingly, what spoil did Gideon take from the kings of Midian? He took their purple garments. This biblical account refers to the exact same time as the purple textile from Timna, the 11th century BCE, and to a society neighboring to Timna. Could the kings of Midian, notice here the plural, be part of an invisible nomadic society? A society whose economy was based on the invisible practice of pastoralism and trade? Indeed, this is much more likely than imagining them ruling from stone-built capital cities. Now let's go back to Genesis 36. We should mention 2 additional methodological issues that further exemplify the intricacy and complexity of understanding a biblical text. The first concerns the location and the territorial extent of Edom, of the Exodus, or Edom in Genesis 36. It might sound trivial to start the investigation from the text itself, but many scholars, biblical and archaeological alike, assume it has to be on the southern Transjordanian plateau, misled by current geographical terms. This region is the famous Edomite mountains, or by the late Iron Age permanent Edomite settlements there, including their capital city, Bozrah. Laura Zucconi, also a former UCSD PhD student, brilliantly showed that Edom was not limited to the Jordanian plateau based on the text, and that its earliest core might have been east of the Rift Valley, in the Israeli Negev. One should also note that the term Negev today is misleading. The biblical Negev was limited to the Beersheba Valley region. Regarding the identification of the Arava and the Timna region with Edom, the Bible is explicit in several places. For example, Solomon made a navy of ships in Etzion Gaber, which is beside Eloth, on the shore of the Red Sea, in the land of Edom. The second concern is with language. Again, it might sound trivial to start the investigation from the text, from a genuine attempt to understand the meaning of words in biblical Hebrew, or better yet, in the Hebrew known and used at the specific time the text was written. This is crucial. What are meant by cities in Genesis 36? In modern Hebrew, the word Ir means the same as city in English translations, and urban center, a densely populated settlement. For an archaeologist, this immediately evokes the archaeological city, the kind every student learns about in their first year of college, starting with Gordon Child's definition. A tangible, hard-to-miss entity, something one goes out to the field to find. But a close examination of the text reveals that the Hebrew Ir could refer to many things, from a structure within a city to an encampment, a gathering place, a nomadic center. The best example is probably the use of the term Ir Amalek in the book of Samuel, but there are more. So, could it be that Edom of the Exodus, Edom as mentioned in Genesis 36, was a nomadic kingdom some sort of a tribal confederation ruled from rotating nomadic centers in the Arava, the southern Negev, and the Jordanian plateau? The text likely allows for that, but I will leave that determination to my biblical scholar colleagues. As an archaeologist, I can definitely confirm this possibility. At this stage, I'm often challenged by archaeological colleagues. Why a kingdom and not a chiefdom? Why call it centralized when evidence points to hierarchical society, and so on and so forth, often invoking Weberian definitions of state and social organization? This is another misleading approach. These discussions are futile in regard to Edom of the Hebrew Bible. Again, we should start from the text. What was a kingdom and what was a king in the eyes of the biblical author? Can the evidence we have support the existence of a kingdom in the biblical sense? The answer may be upsetting to some. The possibility of kings and kingdoms does not require even a single pottery sherd. It might be hard to accept this conclusion, especially by those accustomed to the usual assumptions of what constitutes an archaeological kingdom in biblical archaeology. But as Zachary Thomas and I try to demonstrate in our recent paper, Complexity Without Monumentality, these assumptions are obsolete. They are based on outdated new evolutionary social models, Orientalist roots, and the tyranny of Bedouin ethnography that we discussed before. Not on any real evidence. If anything, the scholarly imagination of a biblical kingdom has been so strong that it caused contrary evidence, plainly visible, to be dismissed too easily. For example, the first non-biblical reference to Edom as a tax-paying kingdom comes from an inscription of Adad Nirari III around 800 BCE. And this is a period where we literally have no archaeological evidence for the Edomites anywhere. It falls a few decades after copper production ended in the Arava, thus we don't see anymore the nomads of the region, and a few decades before the first permanent settlements appeared on the Jordanian plateau. The only reasonable conclusion is that the Assyrian king was referring to a nomadic tribal kingdom of tent dwellers, and if the nomadic Edomites were significant enough to be noted by the Assyrian king, there is no question that nomadic kings and kingdoms could have been the subject of biblical authors. It is important to reiterate that we must not let our modern preconceptions and biases mislead us. As shown by Michael Roughton, Niels Peter Lemke, and many others, many ancient Near Eastern societies were polymorphous. That is, they included both nomads and sedentary people within the same tribe, and definitely within the same political entity. Indeed, we see examples of this in the biblical text themselves. David, for instance, appears to have been a pastoralist who wandered far from his home in Bethlehem for extended periods. The dichotomy between the civilized, so-called, and the nomads that dominates modern thinking is irrelevant to the biblical period. People moved fluidly along the continuum between sedentary and the settled, and most importantly, it was not a concern of the biblical authors to address this issue directly. In other words, the nomadic sedentary status of a people was a non-issue to the biblical author. With all this in mind, let's finish with a brief discussion of the Moabite case. If we look for the standard archaeological attributes of a kingdom, we have no evidence for an early Moabite monarchy. Maxwell Miller summarizes it nicely. I have challenged the notion of an early Iron One greater Moabite monarchy. Most of my challenge, admittedly, involves arguments from silence. But that, after all, is the point. Our sources of information are silent, or at least much more ambivalent than generally supposed. No archaeology, that's what he's trying to say. But what if there were kings there or leaders, Elim, as they are called in the Song of the Sea. Leaders of a nomadic people. As we have seen here, this is clearly a possibility, and a unique find for Moab may even make it likely. The famous Balua stela found near the site of Balua in southern Moab is commonly dated to the late Bronze Age, the 19th or the 20th dynasties of Egypt, based on the Egyptian or Egyptianized depictions on it. Now we have two interpretive options. According to the traditional paradigm, we must down-date the stela so it could be associated with permanent settlements, which first appeared in the region in the late 11th century BCE. This is the solution of Finkelstein and Lifshitz. Most scholars have dated the stela to the time of the 19th or 20th dynasties. Yet, such dating is impossible in view of the absence of any evidence of sedentary activity in Moab in general, and in Khirbet Balua in particular, at that time. The archaeological evidence from the region allows dating the stela no earlier than the 11th century BCE. According to our updated understanding of nomads in the Bible that was presented here, and particularly during the time of the Exodus, we can propose that the stela came from a central place of the Moabite nomadic tribes, perhaps a tent temple that housed the stela or stood near it. Supporting this view is the fact that the central figure on the stela is depicted no less as a Shasu nomad, not a Shasu Bedouin, a Shasu nomad of Moab, perhaps a chief, perhaps a king, leading a coalition of tribes maybe in a region the Israelites had to traverse on their journey to Canaan. So that brings us to the final question to you. Which interpretation will you choose? Thank you.
Thank you, Erez. We do not have time for, unless someone has a very short question, we have 30 seconds. Neil, I give you it. You got up first.
Thank you, Erez, for pointing out me saying the Shasu Bedouin, which obviously I don't agree with, and agree with you on the point of Shasu, or just the nomads that were very different from the Bedouin. But this is my question for you. There is a distinction between kings and chiefs, even if it's different from our idea of what a state king is from social, cultural, or anthropology. So what would be your definition of a king of Timna or a king of Khirbet and Nahas? How would you distinguish between, let's say, a chief and a king, taking away the typical definition of a state king?
My answer is simple. I think this discussion is related to biblical scholarship, Alufim, Melachim, whatever the definition is. First, we should understand what the Bible says. And basically, I don't think archaeology can distinguish these nuances and definitions. It's not for archaeology to answer them. But we should start with the Bible, the biblical text, to understand what the biblical author meant by each one of these terms.